really felt done with the week-by-week study that you had been doing. And while I was here, he didn't want to start a brand new one tonight. So what this little bit of time together before I leave tomorrow morning is going to be about is I want to give you a little bit of extra background on the stuff that we covered this past weekend. We'll talk about a little bit about how we addressed the story nature of the Bible, so many parts of the Bible, and we talked a little bit about how the Bible was not written for us first or for us alone. There were audiences before us, and I've got a document to show you. And on Sunday morning, we even read the whole of Genesis 1, and we talked about how Genesis 1 is different than we might read it as a science book today, but it was also different in its time. And I want to show you a couple of other ancient Near Eastern creation stories. And you can see how different Genesis is from both of those examples. I've got an Egyptian one to show you and an ancient Babylonian one to show you. So the very first thing that really underpinned... I have to correct something that I actually said. In the Sunday morning Bible class on the reasons that we have to believe the Bible lesson, I said that there were 71 people from the Bible that we had confirmed archaeologically. I actually found out today that there are 74. So I missed 3. There is a Persian official whose name is, let me pull it up here.
I was just going to ask, is it Timbuktu?
No. So there are 50. This one does not have Isaiah. So this one's actually wrong by one number. But if you go to the Biblical Archaeology Society, they have a tremendous number of free online articles. One of those articles is a list of the people in the Old Testament that have archaeological evidence behind them. And when those 71 people that I had mentioned, that are actually 74, include 5 Egyptian pharaohs, a king of Moab, several kings of Aram and Damascus, which is Syria now, a bunch of kings from the northern kingdom of Israel, a bunch of kings, including David, from the southern kingdom of Judah, after the Hebrew kingdoms were split in 2. And then there were here Assyrian kings that are mentioned in and outside of the Bible. And then the 2 that I did not know about on Sunday morning were Mr. Nergal-Sharezer. I didn't know about him. He was a Babylonian official who was mentioned in Jeremiah 39, verse 3. And Mr. number 45, Nebuzaradan, is also mentioned in Jeremiah chapter 39, verse 9. And we have a cuneiform inscription from him, a little ancient Babylonian tablet with his name on it. And then there was a Persian official I didn't know about, Mr. Tatanel, is mentioned in Ezra chapter 5, verse 3. And we have also found a record of him outside of the Bible. And then these are the Persian kings that are, he's one of the Persian rulers or elite royal people that's mentioned in the Old Testament. In addition, we have found Isaiah, the prophet Isaiah. I suppose I can show you that, but we actually covered this last year when I was using... This is a PowerPoint that we had from when I visited last year, and we found one prophet, Isaiah, in addition to all the other Old Testament folks. This is what survives of a little seal stamp that belonged to Isaiah. And we don't have the stamp. What we have is a piece of clay that his personal stamp was pressed into. And on the back is the texture of a burlap sack. So the seal was found in the royal bakery of Jerusalem that dates to the 8th century BC dirt. And if you look at it, it was found 10 feet from a seal that says belonging to Hezekiah, son of Ahaz, king of Judah. But what Isaiah says is most of Isaiah's name belonging to Isaiah, we're missing the last 2 letters in Hebrew. Then the Hebrew word for prophet, Navi, and it says belonging to Isaiah the prophet. And again, it was found 10 feet from Hezekiah's, which is complete. We know from the book of Isaiah that Isaiah was a regular minister to King Hezekiah. So they left him off, but in the biblical archaeology list. But that list also includes 30 people that are mentioned in the New Testament that have been archaeologically confirmed. Or have been confirmed by mentions, like in the case of Jesus. We don't have any coins with Jesus' face on them or anything. We don't have inscriptions that Jesus wrote. But these are all the people outside of the Bible that wrote about him historically, like Roman historians and that kind of thing. Origen, Pliny the Younger, Celsus, Lucian, Tacitus is a Roman historian, Josephus was a Roman historian. And there are 20, this list of 30 people includes people that are just mentioned in literature, but the people that we have coins or inscriptions for, there are 21 people out of these 30. We have something not just written, but something material that's left behind. So there are actually 74 people in the Bible that we have found archaeological evidence of, not just written mentions of. Another thing that we talked about over the weekend was the nature of the Bible as a story. People should not be offended too much when we talk about the Bible as a story. A lot of people that are Christians will get worried about using that terminology because they assume that it's not a true story. Right? But the Bible is clearly not written like a who's who book or a dictionary where you just have a name and then a short little description. The Bible is presented not even in a series of do's and don'ts most of the time, which would make the entire Bible just a law book. Right? The Bible's not just a law book. The Bible's not a science book. It's not even just a standard school history book. The Bible uses the form of communication most that in terms of human history has had the most success. We love being told a story. We love, like this week, staying with them. Last night, both Noah and Nathan were like, Mom, Dad, tell me this story. And it was true stories about when they were younger, right? We all want the story version of something.
I have a
Yes,
question.
ma'am.
What is the burlap sack?
The burlap sack would have been a burlap sack from the bakery in which Isaiah's seal was found. Ancient bakeries didn't have boxes. So when they finished baking something, they would often put them in cloth sacks to be delivered.
All right. It's
But-
always good to ask questions. 'Cause
Yes.
I asked my mom how I lost my hearing in my right ear. And she said that when she was 7 months pregnant with me, down where the free store is, used to be Chittenden Bank when I was growing up. She said she fell outside that bank maybe twice when she was 7 months pregnant with me. And that was back in February 1963. And I was born April 13th, 1963. I was born with no hearing.
Mm-hmm.
Back when I was growing up, it was considered mental retardation, but in today's society, it's considered developmental disability.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why I ended up in special ed, and just learning the bare minimum to go out and live in the world.
Mm-hmm.
Are you surprised I'm saying this? And so I've been attending some college courses at the Community College of Vermont.
That's fantastic.
Yeah, well, I ended up withdrawing from one last fall. I took a printmaking class this spring at the Community College of Vermont, and I passed it with a C+.
That's awesome.
It is. What do you think of that?
And you've just given us a great example of why story is valuable, right? You could have written that down in like a bullet point form, but what we want, how we tend to communicate with each other over the course of history is by telling a story. And this is the predominant way that the Bible communicates what God has taken the time to say in story form. So when people have complained about the Bible, why doesn't it just say, do this, don't do that? Why doesn't it just give us every idea that we think of? It's because that's not what humans cherish. And the Bible was written in such a way that we would be inclined to cherish it. Now, another thing about discussing the Bible as a story is that all stories have where things start and where things end up and how things go from beginning to end in the middle. The Bible does that to suggest that the Old Testament or the New Testament and the Old Testament, for instance, tells a story is to suggest that there's a discernible path from its beginning to its end, that its contents have a coherent trajectory. The Bible story has a context.
Did you hear me say that?
I did, yes ma'am. And there are four...
Hey, I'm learning.
There you are. And there are four big parts of biblical context that apply to every single book. One is time, when something is written. That's part of the context of every book of the Bible. Another part of the context of the Bible is the place where something is written. Not just where it happens in the story, but where it ended up being written. Then, big events, major regional events touching the writer or audience are part of every story. Like the Babylonians attacking Jerusalem, right?
Are you hearing me read these?
Yes, ma'am.
Don't call me ma'am.
Yes, Lisa. And culture, by and or for whom something is written. Every group that receives or produces a document already has certain physical, intellectual, and spiritual ways of living, right? Nomadic or settled, agricultural or urban, personal or versus communal identity, beliefs about power and nature, concepts of pollution and restoration. So all the books of the Bible, you're doing a good job.
But Jason doesn't want me to read it.
Well, that's just so everybody can hear well. But you've done a good job. I'll take it from here. You're welcome.
This is thank you.
Yes.
And this is your welcome.
Yes. So,
I know some sign language.
you do. So, when you're reading a book of the Bible, all these things are things you need to keep in mind. It already has, right? It already has a time behind it, a place behind it, big events in mind, and a culture behind it. And a lot of people get stuck on the last one. Most people, in fact, get stuck on the last one. If there's something that offends people about the Bible, it's normally going to have to do with the culture. The more you understand the culture, the more you understand that the Bible was obviously not written just to make people angry. The Bible was written to make people understand things before we needed to understand them. We need to understand what the Bible says as much as the original audience does. But it wasn't written to us first. Now, another thing is, this is a neat picture, but it's a historically accurate picture. Almost the entire Bible was written within an area the size of Texas. which is crazy, but it's true. Yeah, you can certainly take a picture of that. So yeah, now of course Paul wrote some of the letters of the New Testament when he's off the map pictured in Greece and Italy, right? But the books that are written in Israel and in exile when they're in Babylon happen within the size of Texas. The Middle East is really small compared to the United States. And then there is the timeline, and we'll go over this a little bit, but like the Old Testament, the whole Old Testament fits between 4 historical periods. Now, the Bible, the Old Testament talks about more time, right? The Old Testament talks about the very beginning of heaven and earth, all the way through to picturing the Messiah, who would turn out to be Jesus, picturing the Messiah coming and reigning over everything until the end of time, right? It talks about all time, but it was only written the Old Testament was only written in 4 different periods, plus the Roman period, so 5 different periods. Now, another thing that I wanted to remind you of is the historical timeline of this story. The Old Testament story covers, like, this is what the Bible covers, right? The beginning of time, and then everything from the Tower of Babel to Malachi really fits into what we would now call history. You'll notice if you read the book of Genesis that the Tower of Babel was made with baked bricks. The text specifies that there were not enough stones. Let's go ahead and read it. I'll look up the Tower of Babel right there. Genesis 11.
Genesis 11?
Yes.
All right, let me find it here.
And I'm going to find the verse to start.
I'm looking for it. Can you just give me a second, please?
Verse 3. Genesis 11, verse 3.
All right.
They said to one another, "Come, let us make bricks and burn them thoroughly." And they used brick instead of stone, and they used tar instead of mortar. So this is free with your tuition. Although the story is called the Tower of Babel, Babel is just the Hebrew word for Babylon. Like in the Hebrew of the Old Testament, the word Babel appears multiple times outside of Genesis 11, and it just means Babylon. Why we didn't translate it in that one part of Genesis, I have no idea, but it's actually the Tower of Babylon. In Babylon, there are no mountains. Like the entire thing used to be just a swamp, and now it's a desert that used to be a swamp. So this is why when they were aiming to build this big tower, they had to use mud brick. The earliest evidence we have so far that has survived of people baking bricks is 3500 BC. Now, the Tower of Babel could be older than that, and we won't know archaeologically because we haven't found baked bricks that are older than that, or baked bricks might not survive longer than that, right? If the bricks of the Tower of Babel just didn't make it, we have no idea how old it is. But as far as what survives, the oldest baked bricks on record are 3,500 years before Jesus. And Malachi would have prophesied around 410 years before Jesus. So the historical timeline of most of the whole Old Testament is we don't know when the beginning of time was exactly. We don't know exactly when God's eternal kingdom comes, right? We don't know when Jesus is coming back. But in between, the historical moments of the Old Testament after the flood is over is 3500 to 410 BC. And we don't really know when the flood is, right? So, all that to say, we also, just to recap, we talked about how humans started failing, right? We sinned. God told Eve that her offspring would be able to crush the head of the one who strikes his heel, right? That humans are ultimately going to win. They have an option to win. Then he picked a family with Abraham. Then he picked a kingdom with David. And then he provides a servant with Jesus. There you go. Now, when it comes to the story that the Bible starts off with, this is when I'll show you. I have a question. Yes, ma'am.
There's sort of the BI and something else. What does the BI mean?
BC?
No, the BI.
Oh, you mean this one?
Yes.
That is a college course section label. I taught this at a school. So that was just the name of the course. It's Bible 1093. Okay. But yeah. So this is two stories that I wanted to show you how different Genesis is, how special Genesis 1 was when it was originally written. This is the Babylonian creation story. It is the copy that we have is a little younger than Genesis, but the story is older than Genesis. So, when on high the heaven had not been named, firm ground below had not been called by name, not but primordial Apsu, their begetter, and mother Tiamat, she who bore them all, their waters commingling as a single body. So just so we're clear, Apsu was the deified version of fresh water. Tiamat was the ancient Babylonian goddess of salt water and the sea. So in ancient Babylonian mind, the beginning of everything came from Daddy fresh water and Mama salt water. Their waters commingling as a single body, because right back in the ancient world, every part of nature was viewed as a different god or goddess. No reed hut had yet been matted. No marshland had appeared, because remember, this was written in a swamp. When no gods whatever had been brought into being, uncalled by name, their destinies undetermined, then it was that the gods were formed within them. They strove in single combat, locked in battle. It was not a happy marriage. The Lord spread out his net to enfold her. The evil wind, which followed behind her, he let loose in her face. So in other words, the husband, freshwater god, he grabbed the wind and shot it like an arrow at his wife's face. When Tiamat opened her mouth to consume him, he drove in the evil wind that she closed not her lips. As the fierce winds charged her belly, her body was distended and her mouth was wide open. He released the arrow, it tore her belly, it cut through her insides, splitting the heart. Having thus subdued her, he extinguished her life. He cast down her carcass to stand upon it. Then the Lord paused to view her dead body, that he might divide the monster and do artful works. He split her like a shellfish into two parts. Half of her he set up and sealed it as sky, pulled down the bar and posted guards. He bathed like the bottom of the dome. He bade them to allow her not her waters to escape. The waters above, right? But the reason this story reads this way, and we'll finish it, but the reason this story reads this way is because ancient creation stories were not written just to, well, they were all written for the same purpose as Genesis 1, to say where everything came from, right? And why it is the way it is. But humans have long paid attention to nature and seen that they've perceived conflict. Spring, spring gives way to fall. Fall gives way to winter. Winter gives way to summer. Summer gives way to fall. There's hot and cold that compete with one another. There's dry and wet that compete with one another. There's night and day that compete with one another. There's a clear sky and a stormy sky that compete with one another. And what they did was they created stories of conflict that reflected the changes we see in nature. And what is really interesting is that in the stories that we made up, all the gods behave pretty well like we do. They fight and they battle. Yes, ma'am.
Can I ask you a question?
Let me finish. Hold on to the question. And so what you have here is you can see how there are elements, even in the story as we've read so far. Genesis 1 takes the time to mention some of the same things that the Babylonians were talking about to each other, like the waters that are above in the sky, right? But in this story, although the Bible, Genesis 1 doesn't really talk about rain, right? But in the Babylonian version, the chief god sets guards, and they don't do their job because her waters aren't allowed to escape, right? But everything's in conflict, and it does rain, so the guards aren't doing their job. Every time it rains, these celestial guards are failing, right? And every time it stops raining, they've put her back where she belongs. And this is how ancient people viewed the world. And we'll continue. After he had appointed the days to Shamash, which is a Semitic word for sun, and had established the precincts of night and day, taking the spittle of Tiamat, the drool that's coming out of her dead mouth, Marduk created. He formed the clouds and filled them with water, the raising of winds, the bringing of rain and cold, making the mist smoke, piling up her poison. So fog is the poison gas of Tiamat, the dead goddess. These he appointed to himself. He took into his own charge. All the freshwater things he takes control of because he's the god of freshwater, right? The raising of winds, the bringing of cold, the making of... read that. Putting her head into position, he formed there on the mountains, opening the deep, which was in flood. He caused to flow from her eyes the Euphrates and Tigris, stopping her nostrils. Now, what's really interesting is that when you get to Genesis 2, and Moses is describing where the Garden of Eden used to be, two of the rivers that flowed out of the Garden of Eden were the Tigris and the Euphrates. The Babylonian people are also aware that the beginning of humanity is at where the Tigris and the Euphrates used to meet. But Moses names 4 rivers and says, think about where this would be in your mind. What they do is they make these rivers into the eyes of a dead goddess, right? It's much more dramatic. Moses says, just think about where it is. Here's 4 rivers to help you. They have an entire dramatic pagan story about it. Stopping her nostrils, he left, and then the text is broken. We can't translate it. He formed at her udder the lofty mountains. Therein he drilled springs for the wells to carry off the water. Twisting her tail, he bound it to Derma, Apsu at his foot. Her crotch he fastened to the heavens. Thus he covered the heavens and established the earth in the midst of Tiamat. He made flow his net. The text is broken again. His net he completely let out. So he created heaven and earth their bounds he established. Do you see how wildly different that is from Genesis 1? Is it like...
The girls are losing it over here.
I mean, in Genesis 1, there is no war, there is no conflict, there is no drama. It almost reads like an accounting checklist. He did this, he did that, he did this, he did that. It's not like this is an ancient Near Eastern creation story.
Does anybody still believe this?
No.
Good.
Not unless they're actively willingly trying to. Right? But let me give you the Egyptian version. This is an Egyptian version that dates to, at its earliest, maybe 100 years before Genesis was written. I am the great God who came into being by himself. Who is he? The great God who came into being by himself is water. He is Nun, the father of the gods. Another version, he is Ra, he who created his names, the Lord of the Ennead. An Ennead is a group of 9 deities. Who is he? He is Ra, who created the names of the parts of his body. That is how these gods who follow him came into being. What's really interesting about this is that the Egyptians could not fathom. Genesis 1 doesn't talk about where God came from. That's a really big difference. Even in the Babylonian story, there were these stories about where the gods themselves came from and used to be. The Bible does not offer that explanation for God. He just is, and the very earliest thing you see about him is him making us and everything. But the Egyptians had this version of a singular God who kind of named himself into existence and named all his parts and gave himself all the names that he would have, and then he brought all the other gods into being. So he's not one God, he's just a chief God. They still have to have a God for every single part of nature, but you can also see in both stories, they start with the exact same element as Genesis 1, water. In the beginning, the earth, God created the heavens and the earth was formless and void, and the Spirit of God was roving over the face of the waters. All ancient Near Eastern creation stories, including the Bible's version of what really happened, start with water. Humans have not been given. We've kind of done this, we've tried to do this with science now, with evolution. We tried to model, what came before water. But in the ancient Near Eastern world, ancient people were not in a position to envision anything from outer space. The oldest and fullest thing that exists on the surface of the earth for an ancient person is water. And all ancient people were in agreement on this perception. Water is as old as it gets. Genesis 1 starts there because its people couldn't handle anymore. The Babylonian and Egyptian creation stories start there because they couldn't handle any more than the Israelites could. What we do is we send all our probes and our Voyager 1s and our Hubble space telescopes and our James Webb telescopes out into space. And we want to know, where did the water come from? Where did the light come from? Where did everything come from? And the Bible's answer is God, and we just get into this habit of substituting everything for an idea of our own invention and not leaving any room for God, right? That's not going to be any better. But I wanted to give you those two examples because that's the Babylonian and Egyptian creation story. This is when Genesis 1 was written. There's about a 200-year period, depending on when you date the Exodus, that Genesis is written. Both the stories I just read to you are older than Genesis. And then there's the modern Western origin story. Variations of, here's a universe that's expanding, it might contract too. There's a singularity that exploded matter into the universe, and some of that matter eventually formed the earth and life upon it, changing drastically over sufficiently long periods of time into what we observe today. This is our origin story. This is just like the Egyptians had to explain everything, and the Babylonians felt the need to explain everything. We have felt the need to explain everything in terms that we can understand. But God's version of the story is, I did it. And I did it in 6 days. And he told the Israelites that right before he gave them the 10 Commandments and said, I want you to structure your week the same way. So God didn't tell anybody how he did it. But we and all the people before us have been obsessed with wanting to know how it was done. And we've always settled for our own answers. Now, another thing I want to show you is I want to take a moment to tell you some of the things that we used this weekend. I want to make sure you're aware of these books. You can take pictures of them if you want. This is a great book, Thinking Through Christianity by James Gardner. He's the one that I gave a block quote of about Abraham sacrificing Isaac on the Sunday morning lesson. This is a great book to have. I also referenced Destroyer of the Gods by Larry Hurtado. His big thing is he points out how Christianity was different than other religions that came before it. Based on because up until the Roman period, Romans had origin stories very much like the Babylonians and Egyptians did. That really changed with Christianity. And Larry Hurtado, with that book, he does a good job for the history that I talked about and how things changed over the centuries. This is a great book. It's really, really dense, but it's really, really specific. It will take you through the major shifts in how people thought about Christianity and the Bible through the 1600s, 1700s, 1800s, and 1900s through essentially 1970. And that's a really good book. This is something that I tried to show you on Sunday. Let's see here. I think I'll have to put it this way. Textual variants, Hebrew Bible. There. Yeah. So I tried to show you this on Wednesday when we were talking about the Old Testament and the New Testament having a lot of different copies. This is one of the Wikipedia pages I tried to show you where you can see every difference we have between every existing copy of every verse in the Bible. Every verse in the Bible. Like the whole thing from Genesis through Malachi and all of the references down to it. And then, of course, there is textual variants in the New Testament is linked to it. These are every single difference in all the copies of the New Testament. For instance, Matthew 5. Again, 98% of it is all the same. 1.5% of it is stuff like this. Like siagona su versus su siagona. They reversed the word order in the phrase. Or Christ Jesus in a given verse instead of Jesus Christ. Or there's a conjunction in Matthew 5:31 in one manuscript, and there's not a conjunction in some other manuscripts. Or whether it says themselves or himself in Matthew 5:28 in Greek, or spelling here, Matthew 5:22. Some manuscripts spell pacha with a ki, and other manuscripts spell it pacha with a kappa. And that counts as a meaningful difference in the New Testament. But it's not meaningful for what it actually means or what it teaches. The only difference is how they spelled the word in two different generations of Greek. So that's how that goes. Also, I wrote this up for you today. Let me make it bigger. So I told you that the Bible was written over time. I wrote out the timeline. So the period we call the Late Bronze Age. The Late Bronze Age dates from 1550 to 1150 BC. Somewhere between the 1400s and 1200s, Moses wrote the Pentateuch. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. I want to read you something about Deuteronomy so you can kind of know how this works. I'm going to read to you the very first part of the book of Deuteronomy, verse 1. These are the words which Moses spoke to all Israel across the Jordan in the wilderness, in the Arabah opposite Suf, between Paran and Tophel and Laban and Hazeroth and Dizahab. Deuteronomy 1 has that verse, these are the words which Moses spoke to all Israel across the Jordan, because apparently Deuteronomy was written after the Exodus was over. Moses is, the rest of the words in Deuteronomy are Moses' words that he spoke at a given place. But the actual book of Deuteronomy tells you where it's written. On the post-Exodus side of the Jordan, which we know if we read Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers and Deuteronomy, Moses was not allowed to enter the Promised Land. So if you just pay attention to the details, remember how place is part of the context of any biblical document. Deuteronomy actually tells you where it was written. It quotes words that Moses said before the Exodus is over, before he died. And so it's fair to attribute Deuteronomy to Moses because, except for the first verse, every word in there is his. But somebody wrote down the copy that we have of Moses' words as Deuteronomy is the copy somebody wrote down after the Exodus was over. It's there. We just have to pay attention to the details and context of the text. Now, in the Late Bronze Age or Iron Age transition period or the Iron Age 1 or the Iron Age 2A, Joshua and Judges were written, along with 1st and 2nd Samuel, Ruth, maybe Ecclesiastes, the Song of Songs, most of the Psalms, and most of the Proverbs. There are a few Proverbs that are not from Solomon. There's Proverbs 30 is from King Lemuel, or 31. Proverbs, which one has the virtuous woman? 31 is by King Lemuel, and we have no idea who that is. Proverbs 30 is by another king, and we don't know when he was. But most of the Psalms and Proverbs were written between David and Solomon and people who served at the temple. So these would have been written during David and Solomon's day. And these, Joshua and Judges, would have been written during the beginning of the before or during the beginning of the Hebrew monarchy, because Judges doesn't know about Samuel. The book of Judges covers many, many people, and it's not just judges with big stories like Samson. There's a guy in the book of Judges that's noted because he had 30 donkeys. Like, not everybody in the book of Judges is equally important, but Samuel was an incredibly important judge, and the book of Judges doesn't know about him. So, the period of the Judges was probably not over by the time the book of Judges is written, or Samuel could have been involved in writing it. We don't know. But then the Neo-Assyrian period comes along, when on a map of the ancient world, the Assyrians are the big boys, right? And the Israelites are just a tiny little dot on the Assyrians' map. It is fitting that pretty much all the documents we have from the Neo-Assyrian period are prophets. Bad things happened during this time. There were a lot of bad kings, and the stuff that got cherished was the stuff that turned out to be true about Israel's punishment for those bad things that they were doing. So these are the books whose contents are about the early Assyrian period, and these are when the prophets lived who are quoted in those books. Either the prophets wrote those books themselves, or they were quoted by people who did not want their true prophecies to be lost. But this is when their contents date to. The Babylonians replaced the Assyrians as the big boys on the map. Bring that back to full screen. And in the Neo-Babylonian period, there were more prophets that wrote. And the Book of Lamentations, which is a collection of poems about the destruction of Jerusalem. And then, I think 5 poems, as a matter of fact. And then the prophet Ezekiel wrote from Babylon. And then 1st and 2nd Kings would have been written either by somebody who didn't have to go to Babylon or within Babylon. But 1st and 2nd Kings covers all the history from after Solomon died to when the Babylonians attacked. So then, after the Babylonians, the Persians took over, and there's not a lot written of the Old Testament. Daniel, Haggai, and Zechariah, Esther. 1st and 2nd Chronicles was the post-exile version of 1st and 2nd Kings. It starts with Adam and goes all the way to the same place that 2nd Kings does, and a little farther, where they're getting permission to come back from exile. So 1st and 2nd Chronicles is the post-exile history book for ancient Israel. And then Ezra, Nehemiah, and Malachi. And then you start the Roman period documents. The New Testament stuff, the earliest ones were written under Emperor Claudius. James may have been the first book of the New Testament written. James has no concept, or mentions no concept, of Gentile Christians. It might be possible that there were no Gentile Christians when James was written. Galatians might be early, but then certainly 1st and 2nd Thessalonians, and then maybe the Gospel of Mark. It was the first gospel written, probably, but it could have been written after Claudius died. Most of the New Testament was written under Nero. The Gospel of Mark, maybe 1 Corinthians, 1 Timothy, and Titus, and this is in roughly chronological order. Then 2 Corinthians, then Romans. All these are written between a spring and winter, a fall and winter and spring. 1 Corinthians to Romans seem to be written within 3 consecutive seasons. Because he mentions the winter multiple times between these, and he seems to be in roughly the same part of the map every time. Then the Gospel of Matthew gets written at some point, maybe while these are being written. Then the Gospel of Luke borrows tremendously from the Gospel of Matthew. Luke writes Acts. Maybe Galatians is written then. Paul writes from prison, writes all these things. Paul dies, or maybe not, and these documents are written. And then Paul's definitely dead, along with all the other apostles. John is the only one left around, and he writes and finishes it off pretty much by himself. The Gospel of John, 1st, 2nd, 3rd John, and Revelation. At that point, he's the only New Testament writer that seems to be left. And yeah, that's how the Bible fits in history. And that's kind of the background that I wanted to give you tonight. Another couple of books I forgot to share with you. I would highly recommend to you this book. This is Christianity on Trial. It makes a really good argument about the validity of Christianity and believing the Bible as revelation. What's really interesting is that it is directly competitive with just evaluating the Bible against science. This was written by a lawyer who evaluates how he normally has to prove something in a court of law. And in a court of law, we don't primarily determine the truth based on lab results. Like, there's some scientific stuff that plays a role in a court of law, but it's mostly just how evidence works and how many different kinds of evidence you can bring forward and whether or not that evidence is agreeable to a wide variety of people. And this treats Christianity from the question of, can we prove it on the same kind of basis, like is it reasonable, on the same kind of basis that you would determine something is true or false in a court of law. And this is a really, really neat approach because it kind of puts aside the question of science or the Bible, right? We, in real life, we don't determine everything by science alone. But we've gotten into the habit of that's how we treat the Bible, and he points out that we shouldn't necessarily do that because science can't do everything that science can't produce every truth. You know? Science, one of the arguments he makes in here is in one case he has, science can't prove who ran the red light. You know? Witnesses and camera recordings, history will prove who ran the red light. But the laboratory can't prove who ran the red light. And he makes that argument and he applies it to Christianity. Also, I mentioned briefly this book, The Righteous Mind, Why Good People Are Divided by Politics and Religion. I referenced this book in one of my responses to Perez when he asked about, how we're supposed to convince people about things that they don't agree with. And he's the one who makes the argument that the number one way to bridge a gap over politics and religion with somebody is by being the kind of person you are is good and attractive to the human heart. And that gives value to what you believe. Who you are gives value in people's minds to what you believe. It's just human psychology. And this is not really about Bible study. It's about human psychology, moral psychology. But it's a very important perspective. Are there any other questions that y'all had about this weekend?
Sure. So.
No.
Do you know what God means?
Okay.
No.
Good job, Nathan.
So going back to the story of creation by which was the first one?
The Babylonians.
The Babylonians.
Mm-hmm.
So what occurred to me reading through that? First of all, you said this is written before Moses wrote Genesis.
Yeah.
Correct?
The copy that we have is younger, but the story is almost certainly older.
Okay. In looking in that story, it reminded me of the let me see. Okay, so he bound her up.
Yeah.
No.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, okay.
He hung her corpse in space.
Okay. and stop the flow of water.
Yeah.
Right? So what that makes me think of is the theory that it didn't rain, free flood. And that kind of lends itself.
Well, the Babylonians also have a flood story. In fact, let me show you something real quick. Where is it? It's in PowerPoint. Pull it up. So, let me shoot through this stuff.
Love the title.
A particular slide. Tra-la-la. Some of this will be familiar to you. So, here it is. These are all the people groups of the world that have surviving flood stories, all of which involve humanity surviving on some sort of boat. You can see there are a couple in North America that are essentially a canoe, so their story is a lot less perilous than the Bible's. But the Babylonian one is, this is how the ark is pictured in the Epic of Gilgamesh as a cube in the middle, and then the circular one above it is the Akkadian version of the Ark of the Covenant, of Noah's Ark. The Babylonians even name the man who survived the flood. In Babylonian records, his name is Utnapishtim. It doesn't relate linguistically to Noah in any way, but like the Babylonians have stories about the flood. And early Babylonian king lists are specified by kings before the flood and kings after the flood.
Okay.
So the Babylonians were very, very aware of the flood. Very aware. Besides the Bible, which has a much richer and fuller story, the Babylonians only really have a list of kings pre-flood. But besides the Bible, the Babylonians are the only ones that we have, like, they have a written record of memory before the flood.
So who are the Babylonians? Which branch of the Babylonians descend from? Ham or Jacob?
So Babylonians are... That's a great question. I would have to look in Genesis 11, which I can do now. So Genesis 11 has the table of nations, which is how the world, essentially the world came to be as it was in Moses and the Israelites' day, is outlined from the end of the ark in Genesis 11. Here we go. The descendants of Shem include... Let me see here. Here we go. The descendants of Noah is Genesis 10. Cush. The sons of Ham were Cush and Mitzrayim and Put and Canaan. Blah, blah, blah. Nimrod. The beginning of his kingdom, of Nimrod's kingdom, was Babylon, and Erech and Akkad and Calneh in the land of Shinar. So the Babylonians were Hamites.
Okay.
Genesis 10.
Okay.
I see.
Mm-hmm.
So, Scott.
Yes.
So, what God said that when God died, was it similar to God dying?
You mean when Jesus died?
Yes. Is that something to do with? Because I'm confused.
That's okay. We're talking about a lot of things at once. But that was a good job. Good job.
Well,
Okay.
I have this song.
Are those Viking
8?
The Norse have a flood story. Yes.
Do we read that now?
Huh?
The Vikings flood story? When we were reading the Vikings stuff?
No.
No? Okay.
So the people groups, it's hard to see them because the text is a little blurry, but the people groups that have flood stories that have survived for us to know about are the Inca, the Arawaks, the Mayans, the Aztecs, the Pawnee, the Montagnals, the Norse, the Greek, the Akkadians, Sumerians, and Gilgamesh, or Babylonians, Masal and Rukwa down in the bottom of Africa, the Altaic, the Miatsu, over in, where China is. Hawaii has a flood story, Fiji has a flood story, and the Wunambai in Australia have a flood story.
Did you say Hawaii?
Hawaii, the Polynesians have an ancient flood story.
Scott.
Okay,
Scott.
Hey.
That was my question.
Mm-hmm.
Sorry.
That's okay. So yeah.
What?
So,
Sorry, Mom.
Yes, ma'am.
okay, so they all have a flood story. So the flood is over,
Mm-hmm.
and they climb out,
Mm-hmm.
and they have their wives.
Somewhere
3 wives,
around here
3
is
kids.
where the flood actually is where, let me see here, this is Israel. So somewhere around here is where the ark, you can't see my mouse.
No, like
The Ararat, so this is the Mediterranean Sea.
right.
The mountains of Ararat are around here.
Okay. So would we assume, or so Noah and his wife get off, and the sons and their wives. So since the earth is repopulated, are they passing this down through generations and it just gets distorted? Is that what you think?
Mm-hmm.
So
Yes,
these are the
absolutely.
people that
People,
had it passed down.
and especially with the invention of languages, right? The story is going to be changed with the language to some degree. So this is where the ark lands. Eden was somewhere around here. We don't know how wide people spread before the flood. Presumably, there may have been no continents before the flood, right? But the flood ends. The mountains of Ararat, where the Noah's Ark lands, is somewhere around here. And they attempt to create a universal city with a single tower, right? Down here, the Gilgamesh Ark is in the way. But down here, God confuses the languages, and bam! Everybody spreads out. And of course, this used to be connect to this with ice. So there's an ice age, at least one ice age after the flood, depending on how old you date the earth. And so this was connected by ice, so people can go all up in here. People get on boats and go down here. People get all over here and down in here. So yeah.
Was the flood before he changed the languages?
Yes, the flood was before he changed the languages.
Yeah.
Tower of Babel happens after the flood. In fact, it's the first huge thing that happens after the flood, is the Tower of Babel. Mm-hmm.
I think this is absolutely fascinating.
Me too!
Me too.
Obviously.
Yeah. Yes, ma'am.
How much would I
As
have trouble would I be
people-
if I took one of those home for free?
Well, that's the only one we've got.
God.
So, you can have some more. Oh, well, there you go.
Because I would love to have, I think the one I would really love to have the most. is
She's
the
talking about
Christmas
the books.
present.
Oh, the
Not
books?
Not the.
Oh,
I would love to have this as a Christmas present.
yeah. Note taken.
Yeah, me too.
Christmas is a-coming.
Huh?
Yup. Me too.
How about if I give you my mailing address and you could send me one for Christmas?
Sure.
Yeah.
But, yeah. Cool beans. Any other questions?
Sure.
Yeah, I have one.
Thank you for having
So
me.
intriguing.
I just love listening to you. I really do.
Y'all are
And
kind.
I want to say something.
Last
What?
question.
I mentioned this last year, and Scott did it again this year. We paid for a portion of Scott's plane ticket to come, and that's it. Scott has done all of this completely out of the goodness of his heart, and he has spent hours just in the preparation, not to mention the years of schooling that it took to do this. And there's people with that kind of education that are paid huge sums of money to be able to speak, and he's doing this for us for basically nothing. And so we just
So Scott, can
we appreciate
give me
it.
your email and then
Yeah.
because I do PayPal.
Me too.
No, I'm not gonna give you my email if you're gonna try to give me
You
money.
say that.
Okay, no money. I just want your email.
And
Scott, can
Keep
I
being
tell,
funny.
I just want to tell you, thank you from my heart
Sure.
for everything that you've done and said.
Thank you.
And we all love you.
I'm just tracing
love you.
pictures
Me too.
that other people have already drawn, right? I'm just shoving other people's pictures together, but it helps me. I think it helps other people. So
We are
yeah.
very fortunate to have learned and heard everything that you have to say. All the work you've done, all
Aw,
the stuff
I
you've
appreciate
done,
you too.
Very
everything.
kind.
And you shared it with your heart, and that's what meant the most.
Thank
Yep.
you.
Thank
Thank
you.
you, sister.
Sure.
All right.
Tonight
Well, no,
was
well,
so fascinating.
Good.
So very interesting.